it's 12:05. Let's get going.
Can it also wait? All right. Okay, so I'll just do a sort of a brief introduction. Hello to everybody who was dialed in to join us today. We have myself, Tom White from Parallax Photo Journal, and my colleague Charlene Whitbird, also from Parallax Photo Journal. We have Tony from Chismis, Philippines, and the Insights Journal. We have Baron from Matt and Stephanie, and I'm going to let everybody else do their own introductions. So just kind of like briefly kind of run through a little bit about what we're going to do today, and then just introduce Parallax very briefly, and then we can get into the conversation. So essentially, the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to try and keep this quite informal. So once everybody's introduced themselves and Stephanie's kind of spoken a little bit about the work she's doing, then I really want this to be more about a free-flowing conversation. And for those of you attending, please regard yourself as part of that. So if you have any questions or comments, things you'd like to ask, then please do put them in the Q&A. Don't get in touch with us that way. Parallax Photo Journal, which was out by myself, Charlie Whitford, and Matthew Aslett around a year and a half ago. Now we kind of went live. We're really looking just basically to be a little bit of a sort of interconnective part of the whole photography community, with a focus on Southeast Asia, where myself and Charlene and Matthew was until quite recently days. We publish stories from photographers. We publish a little bit of writing, and we're really sort of like looking to kind of do all kinds of activities that can help kind of bridge that gap between all the sort of the disparate practices that everybody does. We're quite interested in all kinds of sort of what's called socially conscious photography, not strictly photojournalism or strict documentary, that brings some of the art practices as well to that. Sure. We have a website, we have a newsletter, and please visit our website, blacks.asia, sign up to our newsletter, and that's how we try to touch with people at the moment. Also, of course, we are on social media, Instagram, and so forth. But myself, I'm a photographer, currently based in Singapore, originally from the UK. Charlene, I'm going to ask you to do a quick, brief introduction to yourself as well. And as well as doing Parallax Photo Journal, I also do a little bit of teaching, currently sort of in between roles, but working a little bit with the Objective Center here in Singapore. And I am also a student studying online at the University of Edinburgh, doing my master's program, who were very kindly allowed for me to access this Zoom space for us to host this webinar. So I keep to the University of Edinburgh as well. And yeah, I look forward to graduating with an MSc and being a scientist as well as an artist. So maybe people will start to take me seriously. That I don't know. Let's see. Okay, so I'm just going to hand over quickly then to Charlene as the next host from Parallax. Yeah, and then we can, Darren, if you want to introduce yourself after Charlene, and then Tony, and then we can finish with Stephanie. Okay, so is that okay with everyone? Yeah, awesome. All right. Charlie, over to you.
Hi everyone, I'm Charlie Minford. I am the digital editor here at Parallax. Let's see, I've been at various points in my life a IT curtain, somebody who did stuff in backing. I had most recently been something of a mix of a photographer, a writer, an editor, and a producer. I think most photographers, I've had I do a number of things that are mostly related to photography. So we are very excited to actually have this webinar, because we've had a year of, at Parallax, the whole of 2024, we've been working on building our connections and being a good link in the chain of Southeast Asian documentary. photography. So we're quite excited to have partnered with Tony at Insights and Photography Chismis in Philippines to actually do this. And welcome to Stephanie. So I will pass it on now to Varun.
Hi, everyone. I'm Varun. I'm a writer-editor based between Delhi and also Singapore. I have a particular interest in the global histories of photography. I currently work as the director of an organization called the Map Academy, which is an online non-profit resource and platform that encourages greater engagement with South Asia's art and cultural histories. I was previously an editor at Aperture magazine, which is actually where I first came across Stephanie's work a few years ago. It's a pleasure to be here with you all today for this conversation, and thank you to Charlene and Doff for the invitation.
Welcome.
Tony, I'll pass it over to you.
Hi everyone, my name is Tony. I'm a teacher here in the Philippines for one of the colleges. It's the only school that has an AB photography program in the Philippines. It's rarely discussed peripheral topics of photography. It's usually studio work and camera work. And aside from that, just recently I was given the post of business head in the Philippines for Leica. We started Insights as a more thoughtful project which supplements Photography Chismis, which is a bit more, let's say, free. So Insights basically it's a writing project, or at least it's a curatorial project of writing for photography in the Philippines. And again, thank you for Tom and Charlene to work with us. And of course, thank you, Steph, for accepting the Parallax grant, especially given your profile in the art world. So I turn over the floor to Steph.
Great. Hi, everybody. So first, I just want to say what an honor it is to be invited to this conversation and also to be affiliated with three organizations in a certain way that I've been connected to. So Parallax, Photography, Chismis, and also Aperture in a small way. So I'm excited for the conversation because I'm a visual artist who happens to be working in photography. And so I actually like to say that I'm not a formally trained photographer and that I work with images, but obviously the discipline of photography is a vast one now. And so, there's a lot that can be said about thinking through the entire history of photography. So as a visual artist and also a professor based in Oakland, California, I'm sort of on the, on one side of the Pacific, and it's been wonderful intersecting with their photography community and our community in Southeast Asia. So again, thank you for having me because I feel like I'm on a periphery of the area, but I definitely, intersect with it. I started working with photo archives only about 6 years ago. And the reason I'm going to start, I think, describing that practice briefly was because that's really the heart of the essay that was spotlighted for Photography Chismis and also the Parallax Award. And, in thinking through images that other people had taken through institutional and national and museum archives and collections, it's been really exciting to kind of, think about how we can re-envision how history has been kind of narrated for those of us who found ourselves in a kind of colonial space in which others were taking photos of us. And so I guess I'll just throw that out because, in the vast world of photography, right, there's so many new images being taken. And one thing I'm always curious about having a conversation on is, what do we do with the millions of images that preceded our contemporary time today? So I can also, I can give a little bit more biographical background, but I'm not quite sure what is useful for jumping into a conversation here. Tom, what would you like to start off with?
Well, I think perhaps the first thing that we could sort of discuss is like, how did you come as an artist? How did you come to think about working with archival material? I mean, this is something that I think is now quite common. It's becoming more sort of prevalent. People sort of like delving into, what used to be called sort of found photography, and now is being kind of, more sort of formalized as like kind of working with archives. So I just wonder if how you sort of came into that process of issue.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I actually kind of see my interest in it as an extension of my interest in revisiting and rethinking history, and but not through a kind of like personal history, more through how institutions or empires have envisioned other cultures. And so in 2019, I was invited by a curator, Wasang Al-Khudairi, in St. Louis, Missouri, to use the connections that she had to museum archives there to creating the body of work. And so prior to that, I hadn't actually, considered what it would mean to do that type of research. Like, as in contemporary art, I was more used to actually, shooting images, constructing images, creating or cobbling together things from internet sources as a research method. And so to physically go into actual archives became this entryway into a vast sea of images that mostly had never been processed before. So a lot of images that sit in these institutions haven't been digitized, they haven't necessarily been, fully cataloged, and they become a storehouse and wealth of information. And for me, the political motivation to do that kind of research was actually about how to look at images of Filipinos and Filipino-Americans that had been taken by American or Spanish or colonial era photographers. So that's a very actually like specific entry point into it. It's since expanded because I've been looking more at actually larger American archives and images of not just Filipinos, but that was definitely my introduction into that visual research.
And then I think it's quite interesting the idea of archives, especially these kind of should we call them like diasporic archives? Like the idea that you might find things in an institution like the Smithsonian, which, don't really exist, say in your case in the Philippines, like in an archive in the Philippines per se, like a colonial record that was then, kind of extracted from the place and is actually being stored, in the metropole by the colonial metropole, rather than being in, the sort of the Philippines, in this case, the Philippines archives themselves. And that, you have this kind of disconnected sort of set of documents to try and tell this history. I know, for example, people who have, been in places like in around Southeast Asia who have had to go to London and look in the archives of London to find records and things like this. So, how do you feel about that sort of photography being sort of stored, in this inaccessible place for the community who it actually, should belong to, should we say?
Yeah. Well, I think that depends on, within the U.S., like I did spend time at the Smithsonian's looking at, see how the programs they had of the Philippines through that American colonial lens. And it's a very narrow vision. It actually, it tells a really incomplete story, but it tells a specific story from the vision of empire, really. So it's not a true kind of like cultural reflection. It's not, but obviously the Philippines archive. And so it was a real treat just the last 2 years to actually go to the Philippines and spend time looking at the holdings of, say, like the Ayala Museum or the Ortigas Library or the Lopez Museum. And Tony's familiar probably with a lot of these institutions. And, that's really, it's such a different vision. And so it was really nice to do that kind of compare and contrast between the two, because obviously the reason, but those institutions exist are vastly different for how they say the Philippines. But back to Tommy, you were saying that, you mentioned in the very beginning that like archive work now is kind of the thing. And it's true. And it's really, really fascinating. It seems like, hopefully others can also kind of chime in on this, but there seems to be a bigger kind of, more artists and more acknowledgement of institutions to have this kind of work done by artists to kind of like go through and, relook at these holdings. And it seems, obviously for very political reasons, I think, right? It's there's the ability to potential for artists to see either, things that have been, missed, or some of the blind spots, or even maybe make some poetic connections that the archive itself, through, a kind of strict documentary method, isn't actually able to articulate. So I'd be curious about when you mentioned that, like, what have you seen in the world as well?
I can say, Baron, I think you're currently doing some work related to archival sort of collections. That's the case, right?
Yeah, definitely in the South Asian context. But I think I did want to pick up a couple of things, Stephanie, that you mentioned about archival work, I think, or physically going into archives. It's something that I've been thinking about as well, where archives are often conceived of as this sort of, I think someone once mentioned to me about how it's perhaps a house where every archival intervention or new object that you bring into it rearranges the furniture within it. It's not just sort of this fixed place where things accumulate. They have a relation with one another. I think this idea of archival work or physically interpreting archives feels like a major thread in your work as well. You seem to conceive of the archive as an active space, and one that's both actively constructed with a certain set of agendas, but also one that can be engaged with in an active way. I think of your interventions with select archives like you're speaking about. I believe this was for Block Up the Sun with the Missouri Historical Society in the St. Louis Public Library. That often also address the physicality of the archive and your work, which involves often recomposition, intentional redaction, rephotography. He's talked about this process as quite poignantly as talking back to the archive, speaking to this idea of an archive as a fixed history and trying to destabilize that a little bit. So on sort of, I guess, the subtopic that Tom raised about the place of these archives, how do you sort of see the work that you're doing as either the interventions that you're enacting as talking back or as sort of pre-situating their contingent position, I suppose?
Yeah. Well, there's the notion, right, that archives or collections are these fixed repositories, that somehow, like, history happened. And then all these documents and images and things, relate to history, wound up in a kind of space that could get held for other people to pull from and, make connections with, or even cruise things. And so I think when specifically when I first started looking at the American archive, it was just so obvious that the viewpoint of what was being curated into that archive was so narrow. Really, it was obviously because, it's hard to blame an institution sometimes actually for focusing in on what it deems important because that's kind of, what its mandate is. And so at the same time, with so much being left out or even, not organized, properly, or even not two-worded in a way to make things, found easily. That was what I felt was so fascinating, because no matter what's in there, there's obviously a kind of curatorial vision of how, it's to be accessed. And so when after spending, I think almost like a month in the Smithsonian archives, going in and searching every day, it really became apparent to me that the Philippines wasn't missing from the U.S. archive. It actually just hadn't been properly identified in it. So, in other words, I was finding, historical things or individuals or, say, organizations, but because there hadn't been a kind of overlay of information put on top of it to properly find it, it was open for I don't want to say discovery, but it was open for a kind of new narration that it could speak differently. And so even though I say that I talk back to archives, that's usually when I see something in there that attempts to kind of limit the way something can actually speak. So, to talk back to it is to almost kind of like tell it, no, you can't cut off the conversation there. If we just framed, his images differently, it actually could say something quite exciting. So, I maybe David, the idea of talking back to an archive is a way to keep it still alive.
I keep that conversation going. I mean, I love the idea of, things not being fixed, and I think that, when we talk about photography in general, I always like to talk about the ambiguities, and that it doesn't, it's often more of a prompt than you think it is. We often think of photography as very, very evidential and very kind of, there is a fixed meaning to it, both in what it depicts and then how it's, kind of then situate in society and culture. It's got this an evidential fact to it. But I much prefer the idea of looking at photography as something more malleable than that. So yeah, I'm very much interested in those ideas, even as a photojournalist. The sort of the idea that you photograph something that's happening and you show that, but what I'm really interested in is the conversation around that, the social relations about it. That's all photographic work.
Well,
yeah,
I mean, to add on to that too, right? Like, even if my earlier work was about, say, the colonial American archive, a 180 completely existed when I started looking at the archives in the Philippines, because then, I spent time looking at the archives of the Manila Chronicle, which is a newspaper that had been shut down during the start of martial law in 1972 by the first Marcos administration in the Philippines. And so the photo collection, the photo morgue, as it was called, which was the term for a newspaper, the physical newspaper archive, that still existed, and it became this kind of time capsule of 1972, and just prior, which was this amazing look at how Filipino photojournalists were documenting not just the politics of their time, but also the fashion, the culture, the kind of like cosmopolitan, global, world of the Philippines. And so seeing that after seeing such this narrow, colonial era ethnographic frozen archive in the United States of the Philippines, it's like those two contrasting, visions, which it was so jarring and also just really exciting. And then I had a chance to actually go to the Philippines to see that work.
Eddie, Tony, do you want to speak a little bit? Because I think, photography in the Philippines is a very sort of popular medium and very wide-ranging, and people, practitioners in the Philippines are very active, across all different sort of genres or grouping. So maybe you want to sort of speak a little bit now about how, how this, like, because Stephanie's work was recently exhibited in the Philippines, and I think that there's not so many sort of rigid boundaries as we have in some places as between, art and documentary and, this kind of thing. So, you want to maybe have a little crack at telling us about what's going on over there at the moment?
Yeah, works of this kind are usually in the periphery. And I say that without a specific valence. I'm not saying that it's a bad thing or a good thing. It's just is. Nevertheless, as we pursue this kind of conversations, I think there are specific places or spaces wherein conversations like this are more open or are more acceptable. One of the comments that I've received from some friends is that what photography Chismis and Insights is doing is too academic. And I was trying to make sense of that word academic because to a certain extent, engagements with photography similar to Stephanie's work tend to be limited in galleries, museums, and also in academic work. For example, in my case, I think very few teachers in the Philippines who consider themselves as photography teachers would be open or would easily accommodate conversations like this. Discussions like this tend to be limited in fine arts theory classes or probably even masters. So I think it's a very positive thing that we have this kind of conversation right now. That's also part of the reason why we started Photography Chismis and Insights. Because we really want to have this kind of thoughtful consideration of photography. And again, I'm trying not to speak from a specific stance of it being a bad thing that we don't have it. We're just saying that there's more to it. There's peripheral discussions of photography that might be productive to engage with. Can I also ask Tom?
Yeah, sure, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm just going to jump in there as well, just to add on to that. You mentioned teaching, so we do have a question from Lily Chun. Hi, Lily. Who does say, how does one teach archiving? So yeah, Tony, if you want to ask your question to Stephanie, and then maybe we can get into that. How does one teach archiving?
Yeah. One of the things that I noticed with how Steph started her article, she made a distinction between the language of photography, the language of museology, which is, I think, related to the next question, and also anthropology. And to a certain extent, that is, I think, one of the very recent development in photography in the Philippines, that we are more open now to a more porous distinction of those kinds of work. Although we do see a specific distinction for each discourse, I like that Stephanie articulated it. Coming from that, there's a specific line which Stephanie wrote in her article. She said, "I do not make work about Filipino identity. I make work about the white gaze, and those are two totally different things." Would it be okay for Steph to elaborate more on that specifically for the audience?
Yeah, wow. So that line that you just quoted, Tony, I don't make work about Filipino identity, I make work about the white gaze. That actually is, I had to write that because in the U.S. this is a very, I think, specific American thing where artists of color are, if you make work that appears to be about a kind of ethnicized identity or something about your, racial or ethnic affiliation, it's automatically seen as somehow this very authentic kind of like space of cultural connection or even like emotional connection. And I am not in the body of work that I did at the Smithsonian, and actually in all of my work about the colonial gaze, it has nothing to do with the actual authenticity of the culture being looked at. It's all through the gaze or the image making or the camera lens of empire, and in this case of American empire. And so, that kind of position and construction, really, of the subject or the culture or people's being viewed is not. I don't see that as the kind of authentic kind of portrayal. So that's a very American stance, though. And so I knew I've come across in the United States in particular, and I don't have the luxury of, say, living in the Philippines and having my audience, in the Philippines, let's just say, understand or pick up on, a lot of cultural markers. There's things that I think wind up being, kind of like smoothed over in the United States. And so I wrote that specifically with an American audience in mind. And I don't know how that actually translates or relates in other contexts. And I'd be curious if that, how did it read to you, Tony? Like, why did that stand out to you?
Similar to what you said, people tend to nationalize identities, and in this specific case, especially for diasporic works, if it's okay to use that word, diasporic works are usually nationalized. They assign a specific essence of a country or a nation state to it, and I think that was very. I really appreciated that distinction of you saying that it's not about the Filipino identity, because in conversations also in the Philippines about photography, there's this tendency to, it's jokingly we call it Filipino pride, as long as it's Philippines or a Filipina, and then some people would say, okay, so she's a Filipina, and then they become proud of it, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but I think it tends to essentialize something, which I think is partly contradictory even to the work, and I think I can elaborate more on that through a question. One of the things that stood out from your work is that there's a certain atemporality of the archive, as you mentioned a while ago, that the time contained or disclosed in an archive is not a fixed thing. It's a constant disclosure. So, and if I'm going to stretch that further, probably we can even say that even nation states or nationalities or Filipino-ness are also non-spatialized. And I think that's in the case of diasporic work. However, since we're in the topic of this essential Filipino or non-Filipino, I'm curious, is this a Filipino work? Do you consider your work a work of a Filipina? And if that is the case, then what would that statement mean?
Yeah, that's a good one. Like, what is so Filipino about Stephanie Syjuco, or the work, maybe, right? So I guess, like, I would say that I straddle, I identify as Filipino-American and also, Filipino to a certain extent. So, just biographically, I was born there. I was a Filipino citizen until I was 26 years old. I have family, all that. And so, but claiming the diaspora, which many of us do in different ways, right? Like, in other words, like, whatever home country is supposed to be, many of us are not located there anymore and have created, like, adopted communities, connected with other diasporic folks. And so that, I would challenge the Philippines to actually see itself as much larger than the actual physical territory it inhabits, because the truth is it's also exported so many people out for different reasons, through either, labor or migration, that it's a much bigger country than just its own, small territory. So I think that's a plus in many ways. And I think, that also can expand and complicate the definition of Filipino. But I do have to say, though, that as an adult going back to the Philippines much more recently to make work and to work with other artists and to immerse myself in the Filipino community, of the creative community, it's only enriched, my outlook on things because I missed out on all that. So I just have to say, Tony, if you're getting any critique or criticism that photography Chismis and the essays that are coming out of that are too academic, whatever. And that's because it's not meant to be exclusionary. It's just yet one more way, right, that the dialogue can grow. And so I hope that folks aren't seeing that, as a barrier, or that, they feel offended by, not entering into it, but that it can be seen as an invitation, potentially.
Stephanie, I'm just gonna jump in here, just to say that Lee Chun's actually asked, how does one teach archiving? Do you address that first?
Sure, yeah. So, Lily, I'm going to take that question into the direction of how does one teach archiving in an art context? Because conservation and archiving is a very specific kind of material and historical work, which actually I'm not trained in. But I do teach a class. I'm a professor at UC Berkeley, and I do teach an ongoing class called Art and Archives. And it's a studio class, but it demands that the students, who are both undergraduate and graduate students, that they target a kind of an actual institutional archive or collection or something that they want to, explore further, and do that type of research, physically go there, and then incorporate that into the production of artwork in some way. So it's a really exciting thing for students to do. It actually, I think, early on, I think a lot of our students struggle to maybe find sources or resources or subjects that they can incorporate into their work. But I just realized you might want to, it looks like you want to elaborate on that question?
Yeah, I think I have allowed her to unmute. So welcome, Lily. Please go ahead. Join.
Yeah, thank you. I suppose you can't see me, right?
No, we can hear you well.
Oh, okay. All right, good. That's probably really good. People should do this more often. You don't want to see me now. So anyway, thanks for that answer, Stephanie. My question is not so much the archive and how you evaluate an archive, which you've gone into quite a lot of detail in the last 30 minutes, but archiving as a methodology. And so I was just in Fujian, Xiamen, and I went. We had a tour of a place called Jinjiao, and Jinjiao is where all the Filipino Chinese have come from. I didn't know that, and so there were lots of photographs, and then we went to a couple of museums that was founded by a famous Singapore pioneer, I suppose, Atlanticist and big tycoon. So he set up two museums, or what, at least not one. Basically, the Museum of Overseas Chinese, and it was just about all photographs, and it was really interesting to see the photographs. But I came away kind of feeling that I just didn't know really enough, except for your typical narrative. And being in China, the people who are kind of maintaining these museums are obviously from the state. We talk about being nationalistic and having a national identity. These are the good Chinese who left and then came back, poured a lot of money, did all the good things, and oh, by the way, big supporters of the Communist Party and the revolution and all that stuff. And so, it just got hijacked by the state, where those follow-on photographs was actually post-1949, which is the whole struggle of nation building. And then prior to that was a big fight with the Japanese imperialist. So you can see how this was kind of going, right? And there were stories from the Chinese individuals themselves, but actually not enough. It just got overshadowed by all these really big state and nationalistic kind of narratives. So my question is actually on archiving as a method, and how do you teach that? Because we need to kind of correct some ways of or dangers of archiving to avoid in the future from what we learned in the past, which I just kind of described. So when you're teaching people how to archive, the text part is often missing. We so focus on visual, but the text is actually, I think, quite important. You know, when, how, who, what, where, kind of thing. You know, plus the stories from the person, preferably who's either taking the photograph or is a contemporary of the photographer, or is the publisher of whatever the photographer is trying to do, or is actually the people being photographed. So actually my question was, how do you arrest all these things, all these issues that we're talking about today, where other people are speaking on behalf of others without permission?
Okay. Yeah, that is a really great question. It actually dovetails into that predicament I think I was also trying to share, which is that an institutional archive has its kind of like focus, right? And it's kind of like predetermined outcome in some ways. And so one of the good or one of the positive things I've seen is that there are usually in existence different kinds of counter archives. And so I know that there's a lot of sometimes like smaller or individual or even like family held, collections of things. And so, that doesn't necessarily solve the problem of the propaganda, was to say, of like certain archives. But the other thing I've seen some people do, and there's also a whole kind of contingency of like radical archivists, like folks that have that try to maintain or reframe things in different ways. And one thing I've seen some artists do, or radical archivists do, is create like I guess parallel archives or rogue archives or shadow archives. And so whether that's like rephotographing things from archives and taking those duplicate images and then recontextualizing them in a parallel collection, it's actually something I've done before. But again, this doesn't solve the issue of how, say, a state archive might have a very specific political agenda. That's actually something that might not ever be changeable. But the question then is, how do you wrest that information differently? So, I don't really have an answer for you on that one. I mean, again, that's like a very deep, like, archivist predicament. But yeah.
Byron? So, Byron, do you want to speak a little bit about that, seeing as, part of your work now is with an institution that, and obviously institutions have to archive and catalog and, kind of deal with all this material. So, and then I think you also had a couple of questions that you wanted to bring to the conversation as well. So, might be a good time to bring you in here, Byron, and see what you have to say about that.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting question. I can speak so far as a person working with these materials at an institution, the institution being a museum with a sizable photography collection that tends towards quote-unquote colonial photography in India. I think there are certain expectations for what colonial photographs from the 19th century, early 20th century of India are meant to convey, the story that they're meant to tell, and what exhibiting them might mean. In what context can you exhibit them? We have a lot of conversations both at the organization that I work for, which is the sister organization of the museum that collects these, as well as with the curatorial department about what it means to exhibit colonial era photographs, say from photographers like Samuel Bourne, or ethnographic imagery, more picturesque imagery, what it might mean to is how think about metadata and how you properly narrate these images. A question that we have often talked about at my organization is, how do you tell the story of photography beyond the narrative of these icons who perhaps make images and create this sort of path of thinking about photography, whereas, there were the early colonial photographers behave like administrators who created this vision of empire. And then there were these, early photojournalists, and then there are contemporary photographers. But each of those ideas are conveyed through iconic images and iconic photographers. I think one thing that often gets lost in those narratives is, just as an aside, the labor that goes behind production of images. Something that people don't often talk about is how unruly and heavy chemicals in, the late 19th century were. What it meant to take photographic equipment to the Himalayas to take a photograph or a postcard. I think so many of those questions get lost in the idea that the history begins with the distribution of the image, not sort of the economic and human capital that it took to produce that image in the first place, and who had access to cameras. So a lot of those conversations come to our discussions about not just colonial photography, but also photojournalism, who had the access to purchase what were at the time expensive German and Japanese cameras to be at the right place at the right time, which magazines were publishing photographers, the history of the double spread in newspapers and magazines in India. I think all of those concerns should be a part of the discussion of photography beyond just, the iconic photographs, at least in the alien context, or a Nehru or a Gandhi, or iconic figures in photojournalism that we all might know. But I had a sub-question that I think we were approaching. I'm quite curious about, but perhaps we could save that if we feel. But I did want to know a little bit more about this art and the archive class. I think that's such a fascinating idea, and I would love to know more about what your students have brought back. I think that, did they begin with a question or a lack? Or did they begin with a subject and then we sort of explored what they could sort of pull or synthesize from that archive? Did it fall along particularly identitarian lines, or was there sort of a range of archival material? As an educator, as a teacher conducting that class, I'm so curious about what you observed, especially thinking about how more parallel accesses are behind it, taking out art sort of that even the aesthetics of archives are becoming so relatively commonplace. So I am as sort of an extension of what I spoke about. One thing I haven't done is thinking about art and archiving together. I'd be curious to know what sort of observations you made with your students in the course of that class.
Yeah, well, the reason I did notes it was because, at UC Berkeley, we're kind of blessed with about 20 different libraries and archives on campus. And so these range from, the Bancroft Library, which I think is the largest West Coast collection of photos, documents, etc., just that run the range from, say, Mark Twain papers, all the way to one of the largest collections of California photography, or the history of the West. And so, and then there's also, the map library, which is all cartography. And then we have the Jepson Herbarium, which is literally a library or, a collection of botanical plant samples that have been collected from all over the world during colonial eras and beyond. And so it's all over the place. And so the what I was hoping when I developed this class was that students in general, no matter what they're interested in, they gotta find something, that they can connect to through that. And they usually do. And so we had students, in some cases it has been about stuff like a very specific cultural history. So say, indigenous California culture, and they wanted to somehow tie it into their artwork in a more informed way than just, observation or even personal history. So I think because we also pride ourselves as being located in a research university, at least my art department does, it made sense to kind of like take advantage of that. So in general, though, the work that comes out of it is all over the place, and it's really exciting. Like some students go hardcore and do almost like database, archive practice. And then others do like projection, installation, performance, video, whatever, and others just use it as a kind of maybe atmospheric backdrop, for work that they already were intending to make. But the beauty of it is that each of them tailors, they design their own project based on, the kind of parameters I give them and give the feedback and work that we do together. So it's been really successful. And I think, it really stemmed also from, early on when I was an emerging artist, it really felt sometimes like there was this polarization between, say, an academic way of thinking about work versus like a more emotional and, expressive way of making artwork, and attempting to instill in students that you can actually meld these two things together and it doesn't make the art boring. It's like to have a kind of research method doesn't mean that the art itself gets drained out of a creative, or poetic possibility. So that's been really nice. And Fern, I'm happy to share with you, the syllabus of what we go over, as well as, any examples of student projects, because I'm teaching it in the spring. And I'm actually going to use my students as guinea pigs for some research that I need to do myself. And I'll send them out to some of the different areas to see what they can find. And, hopefully, we'll have a bigger discussion about it as a class.
Also, so does this mean we need to have another conversation about Sichuanstein?
To see what they find. And let's see what they do. I mean, it's great to have these little research, creative research minions out in the university.
Speaking about labor, right?
Creative labor and the entrepreneur too. Yeah, but this has been a really great, wonderful conversation. Tony,
We could go a few more minutes. I think Tony, has something to say, and then I think we can wrap up from everybody. So make sure that everybody's had a chance to ask what they want to ask and sort of say what they want to say. But yeah, I mean, I feel like we just started to get going. So maybe we do need a part 2 in a few months. See, it's sort of bring it back. So, Billy, you wanted to say something there?
Yeah, I just want to pick up from what Baron mentioned a while ago about invisible labor. Actually, in the Philippines, more and more discussions are also coming up in relation to that. So there's a labor archive that's being mined right now in the University of the Philippines. And I think just to tie it also to the project of Insights, this year's call for article was the complex, and we were borrowing from Jan Hevia's idea of the photography complex being a network and relationships of human and non-human actants. So in a way, the photograph, the end material, is not necessarily, number one, it's not the end in itself. Then number two, it's simply a metonymic sign of an entire process or ecosystem of things that we don't see. So, obviously, John Hevia articulated much better. But going from that, I was just curious, was there any case wherein photographers who were creating the images came up to you and said, "Oh, this is my photograph"? Because just to be very, very transparent, I do know of some writers in the Philippines who are asking if the point of the project is to recognize. No, not recognize. It's to defer the seeing of the Filipino from a white gaze, and also the body and the human being commodified into an image. Some writers in the Philippines, at least in some conversations, is there any part of your process wherein you try to address that as well? When you engage with an archive, that archive was produced by people who were never recognized. To a certain extent, I think that's where the institutional word comes in, that you are engaging with an institution, this abstracted body of something that is actually still produced or constituted of invisible labor. So I'm curious if that issue has ever come up in your project wherein, so how do I recognize the people behind these images?
You mean the subjects, right? Like recognizing subjects or recognizing the...
The subjects, and also in some of your work, because I think you recently in Silverlands you had a project, the Unruly Archive, and some of those are part of newspaper Manila Chronicle, the archive. Yeah.
As from the 1970s, yeah. So I guess I can address that in two ways. So
In the colonial archives, so I looked at like thousands of colonial era images of coconuts, and so again, these are taken by American or Spanish or European photographers, and there are some that are some people that are photographed more than months. Like you can recognize them.
So it just happens to be, anyway, I'd started to compile or try to track people that have been photographed from the time. So like Decon Gorstorp was, one of the main colonial photographers. And so he happened to go to various specific places and shoot people. And then actually some of those people in this list and then came on display. And so names are known. But there a lot of times I'll go into an archive and see those images of the people taken, as it isn't that identified, but I catch by that. And I think that's kind of is whether that overlay happened, later and you get annotated because it just. But if you're talking about the work from the 1970s, where I was photographing images in Manila Chronicles and for the journalists that are taking them. So a lot of those images, so the photojournalists were difficult to find who, and within the photos, who make use of their technique itself, right, on the backs. But they can be kind of recognized by their style. So I've had people tell me, that is a photo. I recognize the photographer because I'm only, say, like 5 or 6 photographers who are taking photographs like that in that time. So that's been kind of interesting to track that through other people's knowledge. And then in some cases, when I had the show in the full case, and I printed and shown the other heroes' work, people were recognizing other people in those images, like relatives. And I thought that was really interesting. So they hadn't even been, captioning the original photograph. Like, they were recognized. So I'm all for, not leaving people anonymous to the best of my knowledge. And so when I rephotograph other chemical gourds, I should have a very meticulous tracking system so I can go it back later and give as much credit as possible. And so, yeah, whenever I quote, let's just say where these 8 images, it's not to lay them as my own. It's literally to kind of like have a dialogue with them, and in a sense to say that they existed previously. And yes, they were key discoveries for. So, yeah, I don't know if that answers the question or not, but they're sort of two different predicaments with the two different archives.
Yeah.
Still. Okay, so I think this conversation was due to last an hour. We've gone a little bit over. I'll definitely be keen to have a part 2. But I'm conscious of time. I want to let everybody go who maybe has other things to get on with in their life. So we'll wrap up. And does anyone have any sort of like final things they want to say? Varun, Tony, anything you want to just add as a final word?
No, just this has been lovely, and it's definitely, I'm definitely love to see less of the best. I think I think perhaps I'm not the only one. But no, thank you to everyone for your time. Definitely take being made it a part 3.
I appreciate being pulled into the conversation, and it's so nice to talk to people outside of the United States. Thank you.
Tony, any final words from you?
Yeah, well, again, just gratitude all over for Steph for allowing us to publish her work, her article, and also, again, thank you, Parallax, for partnering with us for the Insights issue 2. And thank you, Varun, for accepting our invitation.
So, yeah, I'd just like to thank everybody who joined us, and thank you for your engagement. Thank you, Varun. Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, Charlene. Thanks to everybody. We got to do that. I thank my mom, my dad, do the whole kind of speech thing. Charlie has thrown some links in the chat, both to Parallax, to Insights, to the Map Academy, to Stephanie's website as well. I think this is a huge subject. I'm just going to circle all the way back around and say, for anybody interested in this, obviously, Stephanie's work, the book, The Unruly Archive, which includes not just us, but other people's work as well. There's one of my favorite projects from recent times is the Aperture published book on the Sealy archive, which I think you may know quite a lot about. There's also, Susan Mizela's work from quite a while ago now around Kurdistan, which is an amazing project to look at in terms of sort of like archive and community. And then in terms of invisible labor and so forth, I can recommend the book Capitalism and the Camera, published by, I believe, Verso Books, which talks a little bit about that extractive kind of aspect around photography. Definitely an eye-opening read. So yeah, thank you, Stephanie, Baron, Tony, everybody who attended. Thank you, Charlie, and we'll wrap it up and enjoy your Sunday for those of you who are in Southeast Asia, and enjoy your Saturday evening for those of you who are.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good day. Thank you so much.
Bye.